but it's lovely. This meeting is being live streamed. Okay,
there we are. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
It's lovely to see you after a few days of hiding under my own rock, blooming out of it again, and in order to see you all. We are now in the third week of our 4-part series in some of Judaism's biggest and brightest and most important ideas. I gave myself for this one worship and embodiment, and I want to start by letting you know I did not originally see them as two things that were going to go together, and I've been on a bit of a journey through ancient Mesopotamian temples recently, which you will understand what I mean when we get there, because there is obviously something very important in the relationship between worship and embodiment, and I hope to get some of your thoughts as we go along, because this is not one of my back pockets. Of course, I've taught this 100 times pieces, which means your thoughts and ideas are always welcome and important, and especially welcome and important in this particular piece. Before we jump into my source sheet, and I'll send the link to my source sheet in case you want it for yourself. I want to say one thing that I think is important in terms of thinking about the relationship between, let's say, relationship between people and the divine, is how we picture the physical world, and let's say the divine world, for whatever that means, and how we picture the ability to have relationship between human and divine, or maybe thinking between body and not body, whatever it is that means, that we're going to be looking into, I think, in a few different ways. I'm just sending through a link to my source sheet if you would prefer to have a look through it yourself. There is a lot in here. I'm not kidding myself in thinking that we will get through absolutely everything that I've found here, but we will do our best. I'm just gonna, Angela, if you don't mind, I'm gonna make you a co-host so you can just let people in for me. That'd be hugely helpful. So I'm gonna share my screen so that we can look at where we are. I've done this in 3 parts. I think we're probably going to spend more time in this beginning part, but I want to frame us through 3 different texts of Maimonides. The first question that I want us to look at, and I'm still trying to find the right language for talking about this, is the Holy One and the human being. How do we get connected? I am a physical and embodied person. The divine is something that is non-physical. What is the connection between the two? How is it that I have a relationship with something that is so fundamentally other to my experience of what existence is? Now, our ancestors a very, very long time ago mostly dealt with this kind of relationship via worship and sacrifices. When you look at where we are right now in the Torah, you can see our ancestors building altars along the way. There was something that was very physical about this form of giving. Back in Parashat Noach, even, we see this with Noah sacrificing animals. But I told you that the point of this series is to think about the places in which we've changed and moved, the places in which we've been innovative and ahead of the game in ideas. So to talk to you about animal sacrifice, in terms of sort of the normality with which we were doing things would not really be in theme for that. So I want to start us out in Maimonides' sort of concept of what's going on with sacrifice, so that we can think a little bit about, is there anything actually innovative in what we did in temple sacrifice? This is from the Guide for the Perplexed. There are a few places in which Maimonides talks about this idea, and people often take him a step further than it is that he actually, than what he actually said. But just to get us through this. So he starts with, many precepts in our law are the result of a similar course adopted by the same supreme being. That is gradual evolution. It's impossible to go suddenly from one extreme to the other. We're going to get back to that. It is therefore, according to the nature of man, impossible for him to suddenly discontinue everything to which he'd been accustomed. This is what Rambam is talking about. Rambam is saying, we came from a world of idol worshippers, and within that mode of worship were certain things like, let's say, incense. We have a lot of that turns up in Torah and that becomes practiced in the temple. Things like animal sacrifice. Those are the normal modes by which humanity understands the concept of worship. The custom, he goes on, which was in those days widespread among all people, and the general mode of worship in which Israelites were brought up, consisted in sacrificing animals in temples which contained certain images, to bow down to those images and to burn incense before them. My assumption has always been that Rambam is correct in this. And we'll go a little bit into what's actually happening in ancient Mesopotamia in a moment. For this reason, Rambam goes on, God allowed these kinds of services to continue, these kinds of service to continue. He transferred to his service that which had formerly served as a worship of created beings, that is idolatry. By this divine plan, it was effected that the traces of idolatry were blotted out, and the truly great principle of our faith, the existence and unity of God, was firmly established. This was achieved without deterring or confusing the minds of the people by the abolition of the service which they were accustomed and which alone was familiar to them. So God, keeping in mind the author of the Torah, the author of this kind of worship is God. So God allows that kind of worship that has been established in humanity to continue. Why? Because humans are not going to understand skip straight from the entire concept of worship as it exists in the ancient world to let's just say some words and get together in a building and sing together. That is going to be too revolutionary for people to understand. And so instead, God establishes a similar mode of worship to what's going on in the world around. I think it is a really interesting idea. I will admit I'm not entirely comfortable with the idea that God puts together a form of service based on what the idol worshippers were doing around us, because we can't handle the truth, so to speak. I do find it a little bit uncomfortable, but certainly an idea Rambam's not too uncomfortable with. So I went from here into looking into other other discoveries of what was actually going on in the ancient world and in the world that the Israelites would have known. And I've come to a few conclusions. Not many, because I'm not an expert in this, but there are some things about it that I think are really interesting. I'm actually, I will admit, slightly less interested in the question of animal sacrifice. I think it is an interesting question. I also think it's been done quite a lot. And I have become, as I have looked into this, more interested in the question of the building of the Mishkan itself, the tabernacle itself, and then the building of the temple itself, and what all of this physicality is about. Because the temple, the space in which we used to go for our sort of centralized idea of worship, is incredibly physical. And the physical element is not only animal sacrifice. We think about that because animal sacrifice is so far beyond what we consider to be normal nowadays. But there's all kinds of things that are happening here that are really about the fact that we live in a body and that we experience senses as something that is embodied. And that includes the way in which the whole thing is set up, the places you can and can't go. There is a whole sort of mysterious element to what's going on in here. I'm sure you've been looking, if you've figured this out at this point, we're looking at sort of a blueprint for what the temple should look like, which has its sort of outer court, and it has its holy place and its holy of holies. We go in towards the temple, towards more and more physical stuff that looks beautiful and strange. As we go in, we are able, certain people are able to come in and certain people aren't. There's a courtyard of the Gentiles outside, which is, that everyone can come to. There's the court of the women, which is known that way because men and women could both go in there. There's the part that only the Levites and the Kohanim can go into, and it keeps going in and in and in until you get here to the Holy of Holies. This is the place that only the high priest is ever allowed to go into. Now, even before we get into questions of mystery and of what's going on in there, there's something really physical about everything that's happening here. There's the bringing of the animal to sacrifice, or the food, or whatever it is that you're bringing. There's the lavers through which people are, the priests are being washed as they go along. There's clothing that is involved in this. As you're going in, you are hearing and seeing and smelling, possibly tasting as well, depending on who you are and what it is that you've brought. It is an incredibly embodied experience. There's nothing quiet about this. I think in prayer, we often do this thing where we sort of allow ourselves quiet space. I think that having a silent Amidah is really important for that. We allow ourselves this really quiet space and we sort of settle and something happens. This is the idea of mindfulness as well. Like something happens to you when you are in that quiet space, when you sort of let your senses get muted. That's not this experience. This is the experience of sensory overload. There is a lot going on that's telling you what is holy. There's a lot going on that I think will be sparking certain emotions as you go into. I can't imagine spending much time around here and not feeling some kind of emotional, spiritual pull from it. Now this, it turns out, is indeed the basic blueprint of a lot of temples in the ancient Near East. This is not something that has been pulled into the Torah from the mind of God with no sort of intermediate issue of culture as it already exists. The idea of having multiple spaces which you go through, which become holier and holier until you get to this space, is really significant in the ancient Near East. I don't think it's actually universal. Having looked into it, I saw some statements of some people saying it was universal, but I also kept looking up the different temples as they were coming up in different literature, and some of them actually don't look quite like this, but it's common. It's a common idea. We know that altars are common, and this idea of what goes into this space. Does anyone remember what's in the ark, at least in the first temple? Does anyone want to jump in? I know some of you remember.
Tablets of stone, isn't it?
Yeah, we've got the 10 Commandments are there in the ark. Actually, we have a tradition that both versions, the broken version and the non-broken version, are in there. Not an uncommon idea that in your Holy of Holies, of your, whatever foreign god it is, that you would have some kind of legal literature that the god is supposed to be overseeing for us. Even that is not entirely new, although one thing that you would have in this space that we don't have, does anyone think they can guess what it is? It feels obvious to me, it might not be obvious to everyone.
Statue of God.
Yeah, statue of the god. So usually what would happen if you are able to go into this space, which again is going to be a restricted space, regardless of where you are, it will be restricted for certain people to go into. It's not for your common worshipper. No offense meant. When you go into here, is you will find an idol, a statue of the god. And there is an idea that this is where the god lives. That's where the god actually is. Now, these ideas obviously come through in Jewish thought. We have those concepts of sort of increasingly sacred space. We have these ideas of giving something up. What we don't have is an actual statue of God in there. So thus far, in terms of innovation, we don't have much. Our big innovation seems to be that we can agree at least that there is something non-literal about God's physical presence in that space. That being said, we do have all kinds of, language around God dwelling. Maybe God's dwelling is much more powerful in certain places than it is in others, according to biblical literature. God dwells in certain places. But there's at least something that's lost by not really believing that that's where God lives, which happens when you believe in a universal God, and by not having a physical statue that's in there that you go and see. It's not much in terms of its innovation, but it is something. I brought to you here just a few of the texts of people talking about what would be in that space, because that's the space I find the most interesting, is the Holy of Holies. The idea that the Holy of Holies is not an entirely new Jewish idea. Here we've got Victor Avigdor Horowitz saying, within a temple, a god would dwell with his family and subordinates in the divine hierarchy, and one could find therein some tangible representation of divine presence, be it a cult statue or some other symbol. The god present on site could be worshipped. Sorry, I'm going to go on because this is kind of what I just said. Although the common man or woman was not excluded from the temples, public presence was not obligatory, had no active role essential to the temple's functioning. The regular cult in Mesopotamian temples, something noted here, referred to as the care and feeding of the god, was performed by a permanent professional clergy. That might seem, it might seem to look exactly the same. There is a permanent professional clergy, it's the Levites and the Kohanim, who are taking care of this space. There is care, and there is something that looks like feeding. Like there is an element of food that is involved. But what we do with that food is not take it into the Holy of Holies and feed it to God. So there are these like very small changes. Yes, I'm going to skip this next one, although if you're interested, please do read along, because this is actually where I think it's interesting. Having looked into a bunch of this, trying to think about what's actually innovative about the temple. Now, there's an obvious thing that's innovative that I've been mentioning, which is the natural thing that happens when you believe in a universal God. I've talked about this to you before a couple of sessions ago. There are certain implications of having one universal God that I think that our ancestors spent hundreds of years really not getting, and another few thousand years getting, but having a hard time with. It is not a normal thing to think in the ancient world, and it still has implications for us today, that we worship the same God that rules over the entire earth. That is innovative as an idea, and it has repercussions for the temple. I don't think it's innovative for the temple. What we see in the temple is just the repercussion of what it means to be a monotheist. But there is something that I think is quite deep about the fact that when we get to these parshiot in the Torah, that we have this written record in the Torah that tells us exactly what's going on in the temple. Like there's something, and when we get to these parashiot, there are some people who are not huge fans of the fact that we go, this is the measurement of this pole that goes on this part of the wall. I will admit that it can be a little dry, but I think there is something incredible about the fact that the mystery is removed from it by the fact that we know exactly what it is that goes in there. We know exactly what the lengths of everything is. We know what things are made out of. We know what colors things are. The curtain is blue and purple and crimson yarn. It's a fine twisted linen. It has a design of cherubim worked into it. It is not mysterious. And I think there is something profound about that idea. You can't walk into the Holy of Holies. You can't walk into the Holy of Holies because it hasn't existed for a long time. But even if we were in the age of Solomon's glorious temple, and you could only come as far as the women's court to hand over your sacrifice, even though you can never go in there, what's in there is not a mystery. You actually know the exact colors and the exact measurements, and not only all of that, you also know what happens when the person who is allowed in there goes in there. He doesn't go in there to perform some kind of mysterious rite that we have no idea what's happening, but we're hoping for the best. We know that he goes in and he sprinkles this, and this is what he says. This, I think, is the innovation in all of it. It's that the mystery ultimately is God. We don't need the mystery to be the sort of religious magic that happens around God. We don't need the mystery to be the who puts what at the statue, because we understand, or we are prompted, I think, to understand that the true mystery lies in what exactly God is and how exactly it is that I can on some level understand that, or on some level connect to that as a human being. I will say that recognition changed my view of the parashiot in which we get all of those measurements. And I hope that that idea is interesting to you as well. Then temple worship ends. So what we have in temple worship, whatever it was physically that we were giving in temple worship, let's say, we're receiving certain things. We go in there, and I talked about the sensory experience, which might be allowing you to have some kind of emotional experience. Maybe there's some kind of uplift involved when you go somewhere. You know, our version of this might be the hearing of the shofar. 2 years ago, when people were a year ago, when what is time? That's for next week. A year ago, when people were worried about their ability to hear the shofar, it turned out that the ability to hear the shofar not only was important to people because it's a mitzvah and you need to hear the shofar, it's because there's something uplifting and there's something important about that, that very sort of physical thing that happens, that very sensory thing that happens. Now, that's happening all over the place in the temple, those senses that are allowing you, I'm going to use language I don't really believe in terms of sort of like human experience and divine experience being above, but it allows you to be brought up in some way. And there's something that we do that is an offering to God that is supposed to be bringing us closer to God in some way. We use the word korban to refer to sacrifices, and korban comes from the word closeness. It comes from the word to bring something close. So whether you see that as us going up or God coming down, we have all that lovely stuff about God coming down and dwelling with the people. There is a coming close of the people and God that is happening in temple worship, that is allowed to happen, that is sort of pushed forward by a very physical experience of receiving something sensory and of giving something physical. So what do you do in a world that doesn't have that anymore? Well, the first time that it happened, you know, there were all kinds of things that did change in first exile, but we also sort of held on to the idea of coming back and rebuilding a temple, and indeed that is what happened. And then the second time, something crazier seemed to be happening. The ground was shaken in a way that was somehow different to that first exile. And we ended up, you know, the revolution that happens, which is a bigger revolution than I can talk about when it comes to worship and embodiment in general, is a revolution that the rabbis put forward. It's something that wouldn't have happened without groundwork having been laid for a long time. And that sometimes, I think, deliberately, and sometimes I think by coincidence, we ended up in a place that once the temple was destroyed, we were able to pick up and to revolutionize and to understand relationship with God in a way that would not have been possible, I think, some hundreds of years beforehand. Thank God for the rabbis. And we end up in this place in which we have to make decisions about what exactly we're doing to come close to God and what we're doing to bring God close to us, if those are indeed different things. This is one of the classic texts on that, which is genius, I want to say. We replaced what we did physically with prayer. And we end up here, I'm just going to read the bold stuff. If you don't understand Sepharia, and the way that Sepharia works is that bold is translation, non-bold is not translation. So it was stated, Rabbi Yossi, son of Rabbi Hanina, said, prayers were instituted by the patriarchs. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi said, prayers were instituted based on the daily offerings, I'm just going to continue here, sacrificed in the Holy Temple, and the prayers parallel the offerings in terms of both time and characteristics. So we have a prayer service. I'm going to start on this latter one. We have prayer services throughout the day, throughout the year, that function in place of what it was that we did in the temple. This allows us to feel that we're able to do this coming close to God in a way that does not require a temple anymore, that now requires words. This, however, this idea of there being prayer services means that we can't end up in a world of just say things because you want to say them when you want to say them. We actually end up with structured, fairly rigid prayer services that have to happen at certain times of the day and things like that, because they parallel the sacrifices. If we end up in 50 or 500 years as the Jewish people giving up on the idea of there being structure to our prayer services, what we will have said is that there is no relationship between prayer and what we did in the temple. That's not what happened here. What happened here is we deliberately linked the two so that we could understand that what it was that was being fulfilled physically can now be fulfilled verbally. But it's still physical. We haven't gotten to the point, and this is how some people read Rambam. Some people read Rambam as saying sacrifices was for back then. We have words now. Eventually there will be no words and we will just sit and meditate on God. That, I think, will, to my mind, undermine the importance of what it was that actually happened in the temple. I think that what we have is a continuation of that kind of temple worship. And yet, we don't have this text just saying the prayers were instituted based on daily offerings, end of story. We actually have this saying they were instituted by the patriarchs. This, I think, is a very clever move. They have, rooted the idea of prayer in temple sacrifice, but strengthened it even more by linking it to our ancestors who also did this kind of physical offering. And by the way, aside from their conversations with God and the very occasional prayer that we get, that seems to have been their fundamental way of understanding their relationship with God. But we're not going to say relationship with God was always through offerings, but now it's through words. We're going to say there was always an aspect of it that happened via words, and we're going to marry the two. We're going to marry the idea of our ancestors having this sort of verbal relationship with God to the offering relationship with God in order to strengthen it. The physicality of prayer I think is really interesting in all of this. I think sometimes we think of ourselves as prayers, as being people who don't do something that's really, it's not like what they did in the temple. What they did in the temple was physical, and what we do is non-physical. There is something physical about speaking. We don't actually do in our tradition, I'm sure there are plenty of people who do this, but in our tradition, we don't have much of a concept of the idea of just thinking your prayer. We don't just think our prayers, we verbalize our prayers. Even our silent Amidah. I had a teacher in rabbinical school, a local rabbi, who never said silent Amidah. She always said whispered Amidah, which is a really good point, because the Amidah is not supposed to be silent. It is supposed to be whispered. It is brought into existence in some way by something physical. And atop all of that, we have places that we stand and places that we sit. In the Amidah, we like to do the Amidah, which is itself the part that's really based on the sacrificial services. We do the walking into the presence of God and bowing and walking out of the presence of God. It's incredibly physical. We turn and face Jerusalem. At certain points, we even get all the way down onto the ground when we pray. I don't buy into the idea that we have moved past physicality. I think what we have done is move physicality in some way. Now, the idea of prayer for its time, I do want to point out, I do not think is revolutionary. Prayer as a concept is happening already Jewishly before the destruction of the temple, which allows us to have something that we're going to rely on before by the time the temple is destroyed. What is revolutionary about this, I think, is the ability to see it not as something new. It's the ability to go through a revolution while seeing it as part of an unfolding and ongoing tradition. It is, I think, quite a genius thing that happened there. Okay. I just spoke for a really long time, and if anyone wants to jump in before we move into my second question, I will be very happy. And also I'll be very happy for you guys to ask me other times about the discoveries and ancient Mesopotamian temples, because I now have reading that I can suggest to you.
So do we have any evidence of what the tefillot were like at the time of the temple and before?
I mean, it's a really interesting question. It depends partly on how much you trust recorded oral tradition. So, there's the sort of historian hat part of it, and then there's the sort of, I trust what our tradition records hat part of it, which might not entirely agree with one another. So the Amidah itself is understood to have been sort of written and instituted before a lot of the stuff that we know in the story of the destruction happened. So yes, to certain parts of that. A lot of the tefillah in general is made up of biblical quotes. So it's hard also to say, like, what is the line between this is tefillah and this is sort of repetition of Torah. Of course, the Shema, we would say, is both, right? It's a prayer, but all it is quotes from Torah. So I don't feel like I have a very good answer for you there, Louis. I would say the rabbi is certainly presented as prayer is happening before destruction. If you look into the Mishnah, we have all kinds of things about blessings that are supposed to have been there before destruction. I'm not sure that I have a good historical answer for you there, though.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
This is absolutely fascinating, and I'm absolutely with you. It seems, however, to me to be a level on which this is not touching. And it's a level of experience, which can be neither verbal nor physical. and you may well say that the prayer is one of the means to this end, but I think that when prayer is at its best, something overtakes that, and you actually experience something within yourself of God and of a relationship with God, and that doesn't seem to be taken account of in what you're saying.
And that's a really interesting point, Julian. I've certainly been talking about vehicles rather than about what it is that actually happens within the vehicle. Whether the vehicle is the sort of kever, the sort of fixedness of the prayer, or the vehicle is the fixedness of what it was that happened in the temple. I think it's a very interesting point. There is something emotional and spiritual that happens that is not physical. We tend to get there through acts that are in some way physical. There are traditions that do the sort of remove all of the sensory stuff and just sort of try to get to this holy experience, you know, quietly. It doesn't happen as much in Jewish tradition. I think we tend to try to do that through vehicles and sometimes through overload.
But just to
yes, please.
push the point one degree further, going back to the sacrifices, I assume for many people, it wasn't just a question of bringing something to be sacrificed. There was a real experience in that. It meant something to people to do that, which was beyond the physicality and beyond the thinking behind it.
So I think that a lot of the time when we talk about the sacrificial system, a lot of the time when I hear people talk about the sacrificial system or when I read about it, it reads very much like, this is the thing you've got to do. So, you know, grab your goat and come and do the thing that you've got to do. But actually, you know, not all sacrifice, like that doesn't actually account for what the experience is of the person doing the sacrifice. Okay, speaking of animals, you've got to go. That doesn't account for the experience. And B, there are certain sacrifices that someone would give which are not mandatory. And I think it speaks well to exactly what you're saying, Julian. The fact that there are sacrifices built into our system that are non-mandatory implies that people felt moved by it. It implies that people felt something was actually happening in that moment. I think, you know, the sort of imagery of everyone coming up to Jerusalem, even in those times that were mandated, I still don't think people would do that if they weren't moved by it in some way. And I also want to say, I think that the act of giving something up is one of those vehicles that moves us emotionally. You know, singing is something that does that. Like, people tend to prefer singing to just reading their prayers because there's something in the act of it that lifts us spiritually. And I think that's also true of giving things up. I think being able to give something over to God is actually a really powerful thing that sometimes we do overlook. And I do feel, and I think this is probably why I'm being a little bit hesitant on your question, Julian, I feel only able to imagine what certain things must have felt like. I think it is helpful for me to realize things like, you know, oh, right, there's going to be smells going on at the temple. There's going to be sounds. What was this actually going to look like? But I still can't really imagine how much that might provoke emotion in me. But I think it's got to be there. I think none of this works if it's not there. And I think part of actually what's going on behind that question also is like, what does all that mean? Like, what does the emotional pull in prayer actually mean? What does the emotional pull in sacrifice actually mean? Does it mean I am closer to God in some way? And in the way that I was talking about it before, where we sort of see God as being here and humans as being here, and the temple is a place where we sort of meet in the middle, which, by the way, is also the language that comes up in other Mesopotamian temples, that this is a place of humans meeting in the middle. Is that what we are doing in prayer too? Because we imagine that we are provoking a similar emotional experience in prayer than would have been provoked in the temple. Like we know that we feel uplifted in some way when prayer goes really well. And we also have this idea that when we are in a minyan, like what changes? Why are there prayers that we can say in a minyan in a group of 10 that we can't normally say? Because that's when the presence of God is really there. There's something that pulls the presence of God down to us by virtue of the fact that we're praying together. So I think that is stuff that we because of an emotional experience, have pulled from temple experience, right? It's not just how do I make sense of this within the tradition, it's actually also, and thank you for bringing this up, Julian, it's how do I make sense of this as an experience, and how do I make sense of this as someone who believes in God and believes in having some kind of relationship with God. All right, I'm going to take us into the next point unless someone else wants to talk about ancient Mesopotamia with me. Louis, you've got a face like you might have been about to say something.
Oh, no.
Okay.
I agreed to give up on ancient Mesopotamia.
There is a way to look at religious life that I think comes up in some places in our tradition and a lot in other traditions about the experience of sort of being holy and the experience of being human as almost separate ideas. Like, I am human in a human body, and that's a bad thing. And God is God in a non-body, and that's a good thing. And the entirety of religious life is about, in some way, transcending the gross nature of the human body in order to dwell in some way with God. Not all traditions put it in a way that's gross, but there's something demeaning about the physical embodied experience that we're supposed to overcome, and that the religious life is an attempt to overcome. Those are the kinds of traditions that tend to be interested in refraining from things that feel good. Refraining, maybe not from all of them, but refraining at least from some things because of the fact that they feel good, even though they're natural things, because we're trying to sort of overcome what it means to have a body that has wants. I'm thinking about certain things to do with food. I'm thinking about things to do with sex. There's all kinds of things that are supposed to be overcome by religious experience. That I think is very much a question of what it means to be embodied and religious at the same time. I made a joke to my niece earlier today that there's a part of me that just kind of wants to be a brain in a jar so that I don't have to think about all the things that come with being human. Turns out, not a very Jewish idea. I'm not supposed to be a brain in a jar. We're going to start out with a little bit more Rambam on what it means to have a human body. He has a whole series of texts on what it means to be human, which is really fun to look into, by the way, in the Mishnah Torah. It's just a great part of the Mishnah Torah. So he says, seeing that the maintenance of the body in a healthy and sound condition is a God-chosen way. For, lo, it is impossible that one should understand or know aught of the divine knowledge concerning the Creator when he's sick. It's necessary for man to distance himself from things which destroy the body and accustom himself in things which are healthful and life-imparting. These are: a person shouldn't partake food except when he's hungry, and shouldn't drink except when he's thirsty. It's funny, right? Because Maimonides is a doctor, so he's obviously seeing people eating things they shouldn't be eating, and he's like, no, this isn't helping. You shall not defer elimination even 1 minute, but the moment he feels the need to evacuate urine or feces, he must rise immediately. This is a religious text. This is Rambam saying it is a part of your religious life that you're not supposed to do things which hurt your body, which includes waiting too long for the bathroom. I will admit I had a bit of a giggle when I read this the first time, before I realized that actually he's saying something really profound here, which is that your religious life exists in your body. It's the nowadays someone might say your body is your temple. But it's, that sounds pithy, at least it sounds pithy to me. This is a much less pithy way to put it. It is the only way in which you get to know God is in an embodied experience, at least as we know of right now. So look after your body, because if you feel terrible, you're going to be in no mood for figuring out the bigger questions of what it means to be human. And that may mean that I shouldn't eat chocolate all the time, but it also means that I shouldn't be starving myself all the time. I think it's a hugely, hugely interesting text. And I brought for you also, since Maimonides mentions going to the bathroom being part of your religious life, I also brought for you the bracha for after going to the bathroom, because it is a really, I think, probably one of the most amazing brachot that we have. And if it's not one that you are in the practice of saying, I highly recommend, getting a copy of this and putting it outside your bathroom and just, trying to make a practice of it, because it is, and that's exactly what I did, by the way, when I wanted to learn it, the wall outside the bathroom, because it is, I think,
outside.
Sorry?
Why outside?
You're not supposed to say blessings in the bathroom. And that's why outside. So there is an idea that you're not supposed to say prayers in places that gross you out because they smell.
Sure, the effect of saying how special it is to have this prayer about the body that's seemingly profane about mixing with the divine, and now you're saying we should separate them.
I mean, it's a really interesting point, and I think you've got to remember that their bathrooms were not the same as our bathrooms. I think if this idea had been born today, it might look slightly different. But the idea is actually that you're not supposed to say prayer when you're grossed out, right? This goes back to Maimonides saying, like, you can't really concern yourself with the creator when you're sick. If you are, there are texts about this, if you're saying the Shema somewhere and you walk past somewhere with a bad smell, you're supposed to stop. Because that moment in which you're grossed out, that's not a moment in which to pray. So that's where we get this idea that the prayer itself doesn't happen in the bathroom. But I see your point, Gerald, that maybe it doesn't quite fit with what I'm saying. But the experience, nonetheless, of having a human body is still it's a holy experience. That doesn't mean that you are always in the right mindset to pray, admittedly. The blessing for going to the bathroom is this. I'm going to do this in the Hebrew and translate as we go along, because it's great. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. We know this part. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of the universe. Asher yatzar et ha'adam b'chochma, who formed the man, of humanity, in wisdom. And created within him many openings and hollows. Here we've got it translated. It is obvious in the presence of your glorious throne, which I really think is a pun. That if one of them were opened, or if one of them were blocked, it wouldn't be possible to exist and stand in your presence. Baruch atah Adonai rofeh chol basar mafli la'asot. Blessed are you, God, who heals all flesh and performs wonders. The human body is a very complex and often fragile thing. And we are aware that when things don't work well, when things don't work well really badly, it is impossible to live. And when things don't work well in a way that really impacts us, it can change our lives, and it can certainly change our religious lives. And so we have this blessing for this experience that says, thank you for the fact that my body works. It's not the blessing of an experience that says you're life as a religious person exists when you are in a particular building, and is no longer that important when you leave that building. Your life as a religious person is important for as long as you exist, including all of those things that you do. It is pulling the presence of God, I think, tugging the presence of God into those moments with us. I want to do one more thing on the question of sort of the holiness or non-holiness of human experience. I want to frame this through the Nazir, the Nazarite, the person who makes a vow. This is in Torah. The Nazir is a person who makes a vow and doesn't cut their hair or have any kind of wine or grape product, and it's quite extreme the way in which they have to separate themselves from this thing, along with other things that come with the Nazarite vow. It is not a necessary vow to make. We have a few Nazarites in our literature. Samson is a Nazarite. There's a whole thing about his hair never being cut and then it being cut and he loses his powers. By the way, that's not a reason to make this vow. The vow does not normally give you superhuman powers. It is an unnecessary vow that someone takes in order to step away from certain human experiences. And the first thing that we get in this particular text in Numbers is we get to learn Kol Yemei Nizro Kodesh Hu Ladonai, that throughout his term as a Nazarite, he is holy to God. And so that implies that there is some element of asceticism, some element of stepping back from physical experience, especially because so much of this is about wine and great products, that's good, that maybe we're supposed to do, that we're not obligated to do it, but maybe we should be doing it anyway. Maybe we should be letting go of some human pleasures because that's actually a holy thing. Except the text doesn't end there, and as it goes on, we end up with what I think is one of the bizarre, weird, and wonderful contradictions in the way in which the Torah talks about things, which is this. This is the ritual for the Nazarite, talking about what happens when a Nazarite is done being a Nazarite. There were some lifelong Nazarites, but usually it was a particular period of time in which you did this. On the day that his term as a Nazarite is completed, he shall be brought to the entrance of the tent of meeting. As his offering to the Lord, he shall present. All right, so we've got to go to the temple later, and we've got to do some sacrifices to mark the end of this experience. Well, what have we got to bring? We've got to bring a male lamb in its first year without blemish for a burnt offering. Okay, that's one of those types of offerings. And one ewe lamb in its first year without blemish for a sin offering. So that's a chatat, that's here. And one ram without blemish for an offering of well-being, is how they've translated this. This is really odd. Usually someone brings a sin offering because of, well, you can probably figure out why. The idea that the Nazarites at the end of their period of service would bring a chatat either implies that you're not supposed to end the service, which we know isn't true. It's supposed to be for only a set period of time, or it implies that they did something wrong by becoming a Nazarite. This is actually spun out in rabbinic literature into a machloket, into a disagreement that's never resolved. No one can ever figure out whether the question is that the Nazarite vow is actually a bad thing that they were never supposed to have done, and hence the chatat. In which case we've got a problem, because what does it mean for the Nazir to be Kadosh Hu Lashem, for the Nazarite vow to have been holy to God? Or some rabbis have said, no, the Nazarite vow is a good thing. You're supposed to do things like that. That's what it means to be holy to God. And then they have to do something to try and figure out how to understand the bringing of a sin offering. I will say, I don't think either of the responses ever, line up to make perfect sense. And I think that's part of the reason that it's a machloket that's never really resolved. We don't really know what to do with this, but I think that it is ultimately indicative of the issue of, do we believe that human experiences, pleasurable human experiences, are good? Go ahead, have them. It's wonderful to exist in a human body. Or do we think pleasurable human experiences are bad and draw us away from God, and we should be avoiding them? The place where my mind goes to when it comes to the question of the Nazir as a sort of representative of the question of, asceticism, essentially, like, are we supposed to be restricting ourselves? Is that what all these rules are about? Are they about not having fun? Are they about, sort of going off into a cave and only thinking about Torah and ignoring the human body, or not? The place where my mind goes to is Kiddush. And that's because of the what's important to the Nazarite is often around grape products and not having wine or anything that's like that. Kiddush is something that we do specifically, we won't go through this text, but we do this specifically over wine. Now, there are some questions about daytime Kiddush. Can you do the daytime Kiddush on something else? And the answer is yes, we often do it on whiskey. Friday night, you are supposed to do your Kiddush on wine or grape juice, leaves the Nazir in a slightly awkward place. But it's this thing, this physical thing that has become the symbol for the Nazir of what it means to sort of become a little bit more ascetic in one's lifestyle, give something up that's good, that we use on a Friday night. Why? Because it's good. We use it in order to talk about the sanctification of the day, because wine becomes a symbol of joy. We use it in all kinds of joyous occasions. We like wine. And I think this is where I am on it. And, I'll be interested, we are coming towards the end, but I'll be interested outside of this space to hear your thoughts on this. But I think there is something really interesting in the question of using wine in religious experiences and using wine in religious rituals as a symbol of something that we sanctify a moment over. We sanctify Shabbat over it, or whatever, festival or ritual it is that we're using the wine. We use this as a symbol to do that. And I think that the reason is that we're not really called to ascend from the world. We're not called to pretend that we don't have human bodies as best we can and be brains in jars or spirits that float above the world in some way. We're also not called to give up on bigger pursuits and just go and drink wine and be merry and do whatever we want. We know that there are all kinds of rules around things that we can eat. There are all kinds of rules around sex. Clearly, we're not hedonists. So what is it that we're called to do when it comes to the experience of the human body? I think is actually about elevating things. I think it's about taking experiences that are physical and using them to come closer to God. That's the whole point, I think, of that sacrificial system. It's using something that is physical in order to bring ourselves closer to God, in order to understand that God is, coming down to dwell with us in some way. But it's also partly our job to rise up. And how do we rise up? Not through pretending that we don't have physical experiences and senses and bodies. We do that by using the physical experiences that we can in order to bring ourselves and them closer to God. We're trying, I think, to bring the world closer to God. So we use things to... I'm actually just thinking, Julian, about your point earlier about how I was focusing a lot on like the structure of how things work, but isn't it really about the emotional experience? It's like kind of yes, and It's both of them. It's how do I have that experience that brings me closer to God, but not only have that experience as an individual who exists as a spirit, but instead to try to bring my body into that experience, to bring my embodiment into that experience, to bring the world into that experience. How do I use physicality in order to become closer to God, rather than try to transcend physicality, because there's no way that we can do that, because we are embodied. Any pursuit that tries to ascend the physical in the human body, the only way we can do that is by leaving the human body behind, which is not necessarily something that I suggest, and certainly not something our tradition suggests. I have one more thought before I let you go. We are on time at this point and just going over it, which is that Maimonides continues in Human Dispositions, which I do just like really recommend that he looks into, and keeps coming back to the same point in which he says there are two extremes in pretty much everything, and it's not proper for a person to follow them, nor to have himself instructed in them. If one finds his nature leaning towards one of them or susceptible to one of them, or if he already acquired one of them and followed it, he should turn himself towards goodness by following the path of the good, which is the straight path, by which he means which is the middle path. That we are often presented with false dichotomies. I think he means this a lot of the time when it comes to like a human, are we brave, or are we, are we scared? And, how do we sort of function within those? But I think this is also true of a lot of philosophies. We are often presented with dichotomies and told that we have to choose one extreme or the other. And actually we find that most of the time, the most holy path is to find ways to exist in the middle, is to find ways to see truth in extremes as they are presented to us, and not fall into them and never see truth on the other sides. I have to let you go at this point because we are past 8 o'clock. It has been a pleasure. Please do message me if you want to hear me talking about my discoveries in ancient Mesopotamia anytime. And I would love to hear your thoughts and ideas. Do send me emails. I'll be picking them up again once I am officially back, because I am unofficially back today.
That was great.
Right.
Thank you so much.
Okay, so an unofficial thank you, and an unofficial, that was great. Thanks.
Right.
Thank you very much, Natasha. Stay well.
Thank you. Lovely to see you all. I'm going to stop this live stream.